Her name is Frances Elizabeth Johnson Dunlap. She was a fabulous woman in that she was very smart. She was very smart, very intellectual. She grew up in a little town in Sunflower County, Mississippi.
Wow.
In 1907. So you can imagine growing up.
Did she tell stories?
Yes, she did. Yeah, she told some. And I always had the feeling that she was very selective in her storytelling. You know, she didn't tell us a lot, and she never took me there. She never took any of us there. You can imagine growing up in Mississippi as a black girl in the teens and probably early 20s. Not a great thing, especially since she was pretty smart. And coming from what she came from at the time that she grew up, I just can't imagine what she went through as a girl in Mississippi growing up, because Mississippi was ruthless. And how many people she watched disappear and not come back, or go off and not come back. So her parents noticed that she was pretty smart, and so they figured out how to send her to high school at Rust College. I think going to high school at the college introduced her to a number of things.
Was that an African-American college?
It is where Lillian Price graduated from and went back to. In those days, people went to colleges to go to high school sometime, or they went to private places because public schools were not very readily available for black kids. So she went to Rust as a high school student, and then worked for a printer, which I always thought was really kind of interesting. She worked for a printer, and I ended up doing something about journalism. So there's probably a connection in there somewhere. My father's from Tennessee, from a little place called Bemis. I don't know where it is, I've never been there. And they were part of that migration up from the South, and they met in St. Louis and got married and had my eldest sister, Pauline. It was in the 30s, early 30s.
Why did they leave St. Louis?
Oh. Gary was booming. The steel mill was huge, and you know, they were sending word down the river. Everybody come up and get a job, and so it was going to be a better life for them. My father went to work for the steel mill. But when I was about 6 months old, as I said, everybody knew I was the last one, and so things shifted. And my mother decided to go to work. She really needed to, because by this time they had teenage boys, and you know, it cost a lot to keep us. My mother would have been going to work in the late 40s. She went to work as a day worker. She went to work for a white Jewish family in Chicago. We lived in Gary. She'd be up very early. She'd take the train to Chicago and then take any number of buses to get where she was going.
Do you have a sense of how long that trip was?
Yeah, it's probably of the 2-hour variety. My mother was an incredible reader. She was just an avid reader. And when she would take those long trips to Chicago to go to work, so there was the long train ride, and then the long bus ride, and maybe another long bus ride, she was in the book. And she was reading inside Africa, inside Asia, inside South Africa, whatever, South America. I mean, she would read those kinds of things. And then the the house was full of magazines and newspapers and books, always. My father was a big newspaper reader, so they were around. But my mother, for almost as long as I can remember, would subscribe to National Geographic, Saturday Evening Post, Time, Life. Look, it was there. And I think those things were there because of who she was and who my father was as well. I mean, it probably was among the things that brought them together. They had that kind of curiosity and interest. As a small child, because she went to work when I was 6 months old, as a small child, my Aunt Addie babysat for me. And so sometimes my mother would leave before I got up, and when she got back I was in bed. So I wouldn't see her Monday through Friday. I would see her on Saturday and Sunday. They went to a lot of effort to create that kind of childhood for me. And it was an effort to do that. But on Sunday morning, my mother dressed me, and she always bought really nice clothes.
So she started working for the Berries when you were 6 months?
Yeah, a baby.
So do you know how long she worked for them?
Oh, yes. Oh, long time. Up through my teenage years, for certain. My mother was, like always, absent. She wasn't there. She was in Chicago. Well, she actually worked for at least three different members of the same family.
At the same time?
At the same time. Because she would go to different parts of the family on different days of the week. The family that I remember most was the Beerigs. She didn't do a lot of cooking for them. She did a lot of cleaning for them. I know she was very good at it because she would come home and do the same thing. I mean, when it was time to clean the silver got cleaned. You know, there was no messing around. Truthfully, I think that the Beerigs had great respect for my mother. I think they cared sincerely about her. The children would bring her things. You know, well, Frances, what do you think about this? Or I'm thinking about doing that. What do you think about that? Sort of thing. And there were times when she offered that kind of guidance. But I don't think she ever had the responsibility of making sure they were clothed or fed or anything like that. Let's see, who came? Somebody from that family came to her funeral. I think, well, yes, of course. It was Judy. Judy came to her funeral. Maybe Jack, too. I can't remember exactly. But certainly Judy was. And Mrs. Beerig, I really don't remember what she looked like, but I just remember hearing about her. She was obviously a piece of work. She was kind of high-strung woman and busy. Her husband was very successful. She spent a lot of time playing cards and hanging out with her friends. And she didn't know much. She didn't know much at all. And I remember my mother telling the story about her that just cracked me up. She insisted that Tokyo was in China. And that, I think it was Beijing, or was it Shanghai, was in Japan. So she and my mother got into this. They would often get into these little arguments, and they got into an argument about this. And so here's my mother, who I tell you is still among the smartest women I've ever known. And she's saying, no, that's not right. Tokyo is not in China. And, oh, yes, it is. You don't know. This went on. It actually went on for days. And I guess finally Mr. Burick had been somewhere. He wasn't home. And he came back from whatever his trip was. And so he comes into the house, and I guess they're at it again. And he says, oh, so, you know, what's the problem? And Mrs. Burick says, Frances just won't, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. She's just absolutely wrong, and she won't back down on it. And he said, I don't know why you argue with her. You know better than to argue with her about something like that. Of course she's right, and of course you're wrong. But I thought it was so. I remember the story because it just reminded me of what I believe to be true about her. She was just really too smart for her time and station. But the times were such that that was about the job she could get. Daywork going on in the family. As a matter of fact, there was a little tension in my family about that, and you know, my father's side of the family really thought my mother was pretty uppity. You know, she was kind of too educated. She liked opera. There was something wrong with her. You know, she was just a little bit too highfalutin for them. And she, I guess, was looking for work before she started working as a day worker. She was looking for work doing something else. Printing. She tried to go back into the printing business. That wasn't working in Gary. That didn't happen for her. And so my father's side of the family, some of the women on that side of the family would say, well, you know, she thinks she's too good to do that. She was, but she did it because she had us. When I was small, as I recall, she was gone a lot because she was working. But when she was home on Sunday, she dressed me for church. Regular as clockwork. I mean, anybody dressed me all during the week. When I think of my church, for example, Greater St. James AME Church, 2601 Massachusetts, filled with women who did day work. It was the norm. It was so important. It was so important that people have Sunday clothes, church clothes. You would never see them in those clothes anyplace else. Here you had all these women in this church who, you know, were on that bus or that train or whatever with my mother going over to Chicago to do, or to Glen Park or someplace else to clean somebody else's house. But on Sunday, those women were sharp. Hat, gloves, shoes, all fabulous. And it was important that that happened. I knew who she was, and I knew that the people that she worked for really didn't. I mean, they respected her and so forth, but they didn't. They didn't know the person who got dressed and went to church on Sunday. When my mother went to work, they called her Frances. Even the children. When my mother went to church, they called her Sister Dunlap, Mrs. Dunlap. Maybe even Mother Dunlap. But not Frances. I think that was important. Mm-hmm. And it was Brother so-and-so, Mr. so-and-so. Nobody even cared what you did during the week. And they knew. It wasn't important then. When you walked up in the church, you were Mr. or Mrs.